All right, guys, welcome to AP Environmental Science with Mr. Jones. Today we're going to talk about ecosystem ecology. An overview for this lesson, the things that you should know, the questions you should be able to answer at the end of this video is what is a system? Why is scale important? What is an ecosystem? How do we define the boundaries of an ecosystem? And what are the different types of interactions between species within an ecosystem? So we'll start with what is a system. A system is any set of interacting components that influence one another by exchanging energy, materials, or information. So that could be anything from a computer system or the engine in your car to more biological examples. So an atom would be an example of a system, a cell, a whole organism, the entire ecosystem, biosphere, all the way up and beyond to a galaxy. We're going to really dig down and talk about ecosystems here. So an ecosystem is a particular location on Earth with interacting components that include living or biotic components and non-living or abiotic components. So the picture that I have here is a forest ecosystem. And within that ecosystem, there's a stream, there are trees, there's rocks. The air within the forest is also part of that ecosystem. So all of the biotic, the living things, and abiotic or non-living things would be included. Scale is important here too. We just talked a little bit about scale with the system, anywhere from an atom all the way up to the galaxy, right? We can do the same thing with an ecosystem. So here's the forest, but we could also say, well, what about just the stream that we see within this ecosystem? That's an ecosystem all on its own. And we can even go down further and just look at this rock that's sitting in the stream and say that's an ecosystem. So we define the scale. At the big scale, we have the trees, the rocks, the water, the air, all of the animals that might live in that forest. At this small scale, we have kind of the same thing. We have the water around the rock, the gas that's being exchanged by the algae and moss and various macroinvertebrates that are living on that rock, but it's obviously at a significantly smaller scale than the entire forest. We define the boundaries of an ecosystem using those abiotic and biotic components that we find within them. It's how we might discern what is a desert ecosystem from the ocean that desert ecosystem might butt up against. And there it seems pretty obvious and clear. There's water in the ocean, there's sand in the desert, so there's the boundary. And if we look at a forested example that's close to us, we can see that too. So this is a vernal pool. And you might look at this picture, the vernal pools are found within forested ecosystems and say, okay, perfect, there's the boundary. You could draw a circle around that vernal pool where the water meets the land and say, that's that vernal pool ecosystem. And we know the species that are within that. We have wood frogs that breed in vernal pools. We have salamanders that breed in vernal pools. There's algae that grows in them. And insects will lay their eggs in them as well. So we could say, all right, that's the vernal pool ecosystem, but it gets complicated. So that vernal pool is going to dry up every summer. The animals will leave that vernal pool every spring. The frogs will. They lay their eggs, and then those eggs hatch, and the tadpoles grow, and even the tadpoles will leave. So it can get really fuzzy, and that's the big message to take home here is we can define an ecosystem, but we also have to understand that the boundaries are fluid in a lot of cases. Species interact within those ecosystems, and that's an important thing for us to remember and to pay attention to. the reason for that interaction in itself is pretty interesting. So resource acquisition is a big part of everything's life, whether you're a plant or an animal or a fungus. Um, all living things need to acquire resources, whether that's food, space, or water. And within a system, within an ecosystem, those resources become limiting. And whatever the limiting resource is, whether it's food, space, or water, competition will occur between species in order to maximize their reproductive success, ultimately, and survival. So the first type of interactions that we're going to talk about are predator-prey interactions. These are pretty self-evident. Most of you know what a predator is, an organism that's going to eat another organism. Prey is the organism that's being eaten. And if we think of a classic example, we might have a big cat like a tiger eating this guinea hen, and the predator is the tiger and the prey is the guinea hen, and there's a positive and negative interaction here, or there's a benefit to the tiger, and it's a pretty negative outcome for the guinea hen if that tiger actually catches the guinea hen. But predator-prey interactions aren't limited just to animals, or animal-animal interactions, I guess. So these are Icelandic sheep, and they will feed on plants, and in some cases algae, like kelp. And so they are predators, right? Just the prey is herbaceous. It's plants and algae. So predator-prey interactions have a positive and a negative side to those equations, and plants could even be considered predators in some cases. If you think of a Venus flytrap, those are consuming flies. So a plant can actually be a predator to an animal too in some cases. Competition is an interaction between two species where both of them are negatively impacted. So with predation, one was positively impacted and the other was negative. In competition, it's a lose-lose, really, because you're spending calories and energy competing with another species for those resources. So this is an example with a big head of coral, where the brain coral is interacting with this other species of coral. They're both competing for the space on that coral skeleton. You can see that boundary where they're interacting, that white line that cuts diagonally across that coral head, and there's actually like a battle happening between these two species at that line, which is kind of cool when you really look into it. Trees and a forest ecosystem, there's actually a lot of competition for sunlight happening with the plants in a forest. So the reason trees get really tall is to gain access to sunlight and ensure that they are the species that gets that access. The competition is occurring between the shrubs that they grew up from below. So as that tree grows, it has to put a lot of energy and resources into getting big and tall. That shrubs and grasses don't have to put energy into. The shrubs and grasses can grow much faster, but they're definitely negatively impacted by the loss of sunlight when the trees grow up above them. And that's why when you walk through the woods, there's not a deep or a big lawn underneath of those trees. Symbiotic relationships. Those are close relationships between two species where ultimately one of those species is going to benefit. So we'll talk about mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism as three different examples of ways that species can interact. In mutualism, both species benefit. So in this case, we have a clownfish and an anemone. The anemone has these stinging cells that most fish can actually be killed by, but the clownfish has this thick layer of mucus and so it's unaffected, and it actually makes its home then within the anemone. And it provides a lot of protection for that clownfish. In return, the clownfish will clean up any dead tentacles that are on the anemone, and sometimes they'll even attract other fish in who will think that that clownfish might be prey. This is a tomato hornworm, and this is a great example of parasitism. I get this in my garden every year. So we have tomato hornworms. They come and they prey upon our tomatoes, and luckily for us, there's a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs on the body of the tomato hornworm, and when those eggs hatch, the larvae will consume that tomato hornworm. And so that kills it. So that has a benefit for the wasp, and it's all negative for the tomato hornworm. Commensalism is an example of a relationship where one species benefits and the other is basically unaffected. So in this case, we have a cattle and a cattle egret. So this cow will walk. As it walks, it stirs up insects, and that cattle egret will eat the insects that are stirred up. Those insects don't have much effect on the cow itself, so there's no real benefit to the cow to have the egret there, but there is definitely a benefit to the egret. So in this case, you have one species benefiting and the other is basically unaffected. So let's look back, think back about what we learned here or should have learned. What is a system? Why is scale important? What is an ecosystem? How do we define the boundaries of an ecosystem? What types of interactions occur between species within an ecosystem? All right, so if you can't answer those questions right now, you might want to go back and watch this video again.